Whispers of History.
In the rolling fields of rural Virginia, 1852, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, restless shadows over a small, isolated farm. The farm belonged to a man known to his neighbors simply as Carter, a middle-aged farmer whose life appeared ordinary at first glance. Children played in the dirt roads, livestock grazed peacefully, and the rhythm of rural labor marked the passage of days. Yet, beneath this tranquil veneer, a disturbing secret festered, a series of acts so horrifying that whispers of it haunted the surrounding community for years to come. Carter was not a man of particular note. He kept to himself, rising with the sun and retiring when it set. His farm produced corn, pigs, and a modest supply of vegetables, and his neighbors viewed him as quiet, perhaps even eccentric, but harmless. What set him apart was not his work or his mannerisms, but the inexplicable disappearances that began to ripple through the region. Travelers who took detours along the dirt roads vanished. Drifters seeking work never returned. Even local townsfolk occasionally went missing, leaving behind empty homes and unanswered questions. Locals first noticed subtle signs, strange smells lingering near Carter's pig pens, the sudden appearance of extra pigs on his property, and nights when eerie noises punctuated the otherwise peaceful silence. Stories spread, often dismissed as superstition or exaggeration, until a traveler's body was discovered near the outskirts of his farm. Yet what horrified the town most was the revelation that Carter had devised a method for disposing of these bodies, feeding them to his pigs in a process so methodical. It blurred the line between survival and depravity. From an outsider's perspective, the farm appeared normal. Pigs rooted at the edges of muddy pens, crops swaying in the wind, the farmhouse sturdy and well kept. But at night, the place became a stage for clandestine activities hidden from the prying eyes of neighbors and law enforcement. Carter's knowledge of the human body, combined with an understanding of animal behavior, allowed him to carry out these acts without detection. He observed patterns, experimented with feeding schedules, and ensured that no trace of his crimes remained until the compounding oddities finally attracted attention beyond the farm's borders. The first victims were those who traveled alone, drawn by the promise of work or rest. Carter's approach was subtle. He gained their trust, offered lodging or food, and then orchestrated circumstances that ensured they would not leave alive. Villagers spoke later of an eerie calm surrounding the farm at night, as if the land itself held its breath, allowing the horror within to unfold unseen. Even the pigs seemed to sense the unnaturalness of their diet, reacting with moments of agitation that unsettled anyone observing too closely. Neighbors, initially suspicious of Carter's eccentricities, began to piece together a pattern. They noted the peculiar timing of his activities, the unusual increase in livestock, and the subtle but unmistakable changes in the local environment. Yet fear, rural isolation, and the stigma of accusing a seemingly ordinary man kept them silent. Children were warned not to stray near the farm. Travelers were advised to avoid it altogether. The farm became an unspoken boundary, a place shrouded in caution and whispered speculation, where the ordinary rhythms of daily life concealed extraordinary evil. The hook of Carter's story lies not just in the grotesque nature of his acts, but in the paradox of their execution. A man who outwardly embodied the archetypal American farmer, rooted in labor, community, and the land, yet whose nights were marked by calculated violence and consumption of human life. The dichotomy fascinated and repelled observers alike, creating a persistent tension between appearance and reality, normality and monstrosity. In this quiet, unassuming corner of Virginia, Carter's deeds became a lens through which to examine human capacity for concealment, the vulnerabilities of isolated communities, and the terrifying possibility that monstrous acts can coexist with ordinary life. The farm, the pigs, and the empty roads became symbols of both suspicion and dread. A landscape in which curiosity was laced with danger and discovery could lead to unimaginable horror. As the story unfolds, the mystery deepens. How could such acts remain hidden for so long? What drove a man to integrate human flesh into the routine of livestock care? And what echoes of fear did he leave behind in the minds of those who lived nearby, forever altering the community's sense of safety and trust? The answers, steeped in historical context, psychological tension, and the macabre, begin here, on a quiet Virginia farm where shadows held more than darkness, and silence was a witness to the unspeakable. In mid-19th century Virginia, life was dominated by agriculture, community networks, and the rhythms of seasonal labor. Farms dotted the landscape, often isolated by stretches of forest, rolling hills, and dirt roads. Most residents depended on self-sufficiency. Families grew crops, raised livestock, and relied on neighbors for shared resources and mutual aid. Travel was slow, with the occasional wagon or horseback rider punctuating the quiet countryside, and news traveled as fast as word of mouth allowed. Within this context, isolation was not just a feature of rural life, it was a defining condition that shaped behavior, norms, and social cohesion. The social environment was structured around kinship, local governance, and shared cultural expectations. Communities placed high value on reputation, public appearances, and moral conduct. Deviations from accepted behavior were noticed quickly, but in many cases, enforcement relied on informal observation, gossip, or community pressure rather than formal policing. The local justice system existed, but law enforcement in rural areas was limited, leaving vast tracts of land where private actions went largely unmonitored. This gap between societal norms and practical oversight created conditions in which unusual or criminal behavior could remain undetected, particularly when executed with cunning and attention to detail. Economically, Virginia's rural areas were shaped by subsistence and small-scale commercial farming. Pigs, cows, and chickens were essential for nutrition and trade, while crops like corn, wheat, and vegetables sustained families and provided modest income. Pigs in particular played a crucial role. They were easy to feed, adaptable to various foraging methods, and a reliable source of meat and fat. The presence of a large pig herd was common on farms, but it also provided a convenient, if unintentional, cover for those with nefarious intentions. Knowledge of animal behavior and feeding patterns was part of daily life for farmers, a skill that could be exploited by someone with darker motives. Cultural and scientific understandings of the time were limited regarding disease transmission, decomposition, and forensic identification. Rural communities often interpreted unusual events through the lenses of folklore, superstition, or religious morality. Strange occurrences might be explained as divine punishment, witchcraft, or the result of moral failing. Scientific inquiry into criminology, pathology, or forensic analysis was in its infancy. Systematic investigation into unexplained disappearances or deaths was rare, especially in isolated regions. This context made it far easier for someone like Carter to manipulate circumstances and avoid scrutiny, since his methods were largely invisible to the understanding of neighbors or authorities. The broader historical backdrop of 1850s Virginia was also influential. This period was marked by social stratification, regional tensions, and economic pressures. Families were often preoccupied with survival, labor, and maintaining the functionality of their households. Disappearances, when they occurred, were sometimes assumed to be the result of accidents, wandering, or relocation. A stranger passing through could vanish without immediate alarm, and even local residents might be presumed to have gone to visit relatives or work elsewhere. This cultural assumption of mobility and impermanence added another layer of concealment to Carter's actions. Religion and moral authority also shaped the fabric of rural Virginia. Churches served as both spiritual and social centers, providing guidance, moral oversight, and a communal sense of right and wrong. Sermons warned of sin, greed, and the consequences of moral corruption, but their reach was limited to the interpretive frameworks of the listeners. Communities relied on shared ethical standards to maintain cohesion, but enforcement was largely social rather than legal. A man like Carter could maintain an outward appearance of piety and industriousness while secretly subverting those standards, exploiting the trust inherent in community structures. Education was inconsistent, particularly in rural areas. Most knowledge about human anatomy, decomposition, or toxicology was derived from limited reading, apprenticeships, or oral tradition. Formal education was available in some towns, but for isolated farmers, practical experience often outweighed theoretical understanding. This combination of limited oversight, sparse scientific knowledge, and social isolation created conditions in which a careful and observant individual could commit acts that might otherwise be discovered and condemned. Communication between towns was slow, reliant on letters, travelers, or occasional newspaper reports. News of crimes, oddities, or missing persons could take weeks or months to circulate, allowing patterns to remain obscured. Local folklore often filled gaps in understanding, blending rumor and reality into narratives that served as both cautionary tale and explanation for the unexplainable. Within this ecosystem of limited observation and informal knowledge, Carter's activities could persist unnoticed until patterns emerged that demanded attention. Livestock management and human-animal interactions were central to daily life. Farmers knew their pigs, cows, and chickens intimately, understanding feeding habits, reproductive cycles, and signs of illness. Pigs, in particular, were omnivorous and highly adaptable, able to consume a wide range of organic matter. This biological fact, known but not publicly scrutinized, provided a cover mechanism. By feeding the remains of human victims to pigs, Carter leveraged a natural process that appeared ordinary to anyone observing from the outside. The interplay of biology, isolation, and rural practices created a situation where detection relied less on the sophistication of law enforcement and more on the attentiveness and willingness of neighbors to question the ordinary. Through this lens, Carter's actions were not only horrific but also intricately entwined with the social, cultural, and ecological fabric of 1850s Virginia. They reflected an understanding of human psychology, community norms, and natural processes that allowed him to operate under the radar. The intersection of isolation, trust, and practical farming knowledge provided both the cover and the mechanism for his crimes, highlighting a chilling truth. Atrocities can be embedded within the mundane when societal safeguards are limited, knowledge is incomplete, and appearances are trusted more than scrutiny. Understanding this historical context is critical to comprehending the full scope of the narrative. Carter's farm, his livestock, and his relationship to the surrounding community were not simply the backdrop for horror, they were the instruments through which it unfolded. Every choice, from the design of pens to the timing of feedings, relied on the interplay between human perception and natural behavior. Neighbors assumed ordinary patterns. Travelers trusted the farm as a place of respite. The pigs consumed without suspicion. Within these intersecting realities, the horrific acts could exist without immediate detection, a testament to both the ingenuity and depravity of the perpetrator. By examining mid-19th century Virginia's rural life, social norms, and ecological realities, it becomes evident how a combination of isolation, trust, and natural process can mask the most unimaginable crimes. The stage was set for horror to unfold quietly, methodically, and persistently until the signs of abnormality could no longer be ignored, and the shadowed farm became a locus of suspicion, fear, and ultimately, historical infamy. The first incident that drew suspicion was subtle, almost imperceptible to the casual observer. A young traveler seeking work in the area arrived at Carter's farm on a late afternoon. The man was welcomed warmly, offered food and lodging, and left his horse in the barn for the night. That evening, villagers reported hearing an unusual commotion near the pig pens, a cacophony of grunts, splashing, and frantic squeals that persisted until the small hours. By morning, the traveler had vanished. His horse remained tethered, his belongings scattered, but there was no sign of him on the road or in the nearby woods. Only later would it be understood that the farm itself had consumed him, his body a grim meal for the swine, hidden in plain sight beneath layers of straw and mud. Subsequent incidents followed a chillingly similar pattern. Outsiders, often isolated individuals, were welcomed into the farmhouse under the guise of hospitality. Meals were shared, work assigned, and trust cultivated. Then, when darkness fell, Carter orchestrated circumstances that ensured the victim would not survive the night. The methods were precise. A rope slipped unnoticed around a neck, a hidden knife left within reach of an unsuspecting hand, a trapdoor in the barn floor leading to a subterranean pen. Each act was executed with a calm, methodical precision that belied the horror of the outcome. Neighbors began to note peculiar details. The pigs seemed unusually healthy, their numbers inexplicably large. At first, this was attributed to simple good fortune or careful breeding. Yet closer observation revealed the disturbing truth. The animals were thriving on an unnatural diet. Human remains, carefully dismembered and concealed, were introduced to the pens, accelerating growth and fattening the livestock far beyond ordinary means. Carter, ever meticulous, ensured that no bones or identifying markers were left exposed. The pigs became both witnesses and accomplices. their natural feeding behavior masking the crime. One particularly harrowing case involved a traveling salesman who had arrived during a storm. Seeking shelter, he was offered a room in the farmhouse. That night, screams erupted from the barn, a sound so primal it caused nearby families to retreat indoors, windows shuttered. When the storm cleared, the man was gone. Only the pigs, sated and strangely silent, remained. Neighbors later reported that the barn smelled differently in the aftermath, an odor that lingered for weeks despite repeated cleaning. Carter's meticulous attention to hygiene and concealment ensured that evidence was minimal, leaving only instinct and fear to guide suspicion. Other victims were less fortunate, drawn by simple necessity. A young boy, collecting firewood, wandered near the edge of the farm and was caught in a concealed trap. Carter acted swiftly, moving the child to the pig pens before anyone could intervene. The boy's disappearance remained unexplained, generating both rumors and terror among local families. Mothers warned children to avoid the farm. Travelers avoided the area, but the absence of concrete evidence kept fear from translating into direct action. In each of these incidents, Carter demonstrated an almost clinical understanding of timing, geography, and perception. He leveraged the isolation of the farm, the trust of his neighbors, and the predictable behavior of both humans and animals to execute his acts undetected. Windows were carefully covered, doors latched at specific intervals, and the pigs fed at precise times to mask the physical signs of violence. He understood decomposition, knowing how long it would take for odor and visibility to betray his actions. Each death was choreographed to minimize exposure, reflecting a methodical and terrifying intelligence. Yet, not all attempts went as smoothly. On one occasion, a traveler resisted an initial attack, fleeing into the woods. Carter pursued, employing both cunning and force to capture the man before he could reach the nearest road. The struggle left evidence: displaced soil, broken branches, and disturbed underbrush. While neighbors noticed the disruption, they attributed it to natural causes, storms, or animal activity. The episode, however, marked a subtle shift in the community's perception, planting seeds of doubt and unease that would later grow into suspicion. In addition to physical methods, Carter employed psychological manipulation. He fostered a reputation of generosity and civility, ensuring that those who might question him were inclined to trust his intentions. He maintained cordial relationships with neighbors, shared crops and produce, and performed small acts of charity, creating an image that shielded him from scrutiny. Any aberrant behavior, such as the odd noises or unusual livestock growth, was rationalized within the framework of an otherwise reputable farmer. The farm itself became a labyrinth of hidden mechanisms and secret passages. Trapdoors, concealed chutes, and modified pens facilitated the swift disposal of bodies. Each mechanism was disguised as ordinary farm infrastructure: a feed chute, a storage cellar, or a mud-covered pit. This ingenuity not only enabled the crimes but also created an almost ritualistic pattern, a systemized approach that highlighted Carter's obsessive attention to control. Even the pigs seemed integrated into the performance, their instinctive behavior providing a natural camouflage for the grotesque acts occurring around them. As the incidents accumulated, the psychological toll on the community intensified. Families whispered warnings, rumors spread of the man who feeds on flesh, and the local landscape took on a menacing character. Children avoided the farm. Travelers circumvented it. Yet, formal investigation remained minimal, both because of the limited capabilities of rural law enforcement and the subtlety of Carter's methods. The horror persisted in the form of speculation and dread rather than documented proof, creating a pervasive tension between fear and certainty. In one final series of incidents, Carter's ingenuity and cruelty were displayed at their peak. A group of 3 strangers seeking shelter simultaneously became targets. Each was separated under the guise of farm chores, lured to isolated areas, and dispatched with careful precision. The remains were processed to feed the pigs, leaving no evidence but the subtle increase in animal vitality and the lingering, unidentifiable odors. Neighbors reported sensing a strangeness to the farm, yet were unable to identify its source. The combination of terror, skill, and invisibility rendered Carter effectively untouchable within the rural context. Throughout these events, the interplay of method, opportunity, and environment shaped both the crimes and the community's response. Carter exploited human trust, rural isolation, and biological processes to commit acts that were both meticulously concealed and profoundly horrifying. Each incident reinforced the mythos surrounding the farm, a place of hidden danger where the ordinary rhythms of agrarian life concealed unspeakable atrocities. Ultimately, the story of Carter and his victims is one of meticulous calculation, social manipulation, and exploitation of environmental and psychological conditions. The incidents collectively illustrate not only the horror of the acts themselves, but also the broader vulnerabilities of isolated communities, the limitations of 19th century law enforcement, and the chilling potential for evil to hide within the everyday. The farm, its pigs, and the surrounding land became a stage on which horror unfolded quietly, leaving behind only whispers, suspicion, and an enduring sense of unease. As the disappearances mounted and whispers began to circulate, the people of the surrounding community faced a mixture of fear, disbelief, and moral confusion. Families who had once passed by Carter's farm without thought now felt a deep, unsettling unease whenever they approached. Mothers clutched children tightly, warning them not to wander near the property, and travelers actively avoided the area, sensing that some invisible danger lingered in the shadows of the barn and pens. Fear became embedded in daily routines, shaping behaviors in subtle but persistent ways. Neighbors began sharing stories in hushed tones at local gatherings, each tale tinged with speculation and rumor. Some spoke of hearing screams or seeing unusual animal behavior. Others recounted the disappearance of travelers who had last been seen heading toward Carter's property. Yet, the lack of concrete evidence made the community hesitant to confront the farmer directly. The social structures of trust and politeness that defined rural life at the time complicated any attempt at collective action. People were reluctant to accuse a man who had long been considered hospitable, industrious, and outwardly moral. Local clergy played a critical role in interpreting these strange occurrences. Pastors delivered sermons emphasizing the dangers of moral corruption, sin, and temptation, framing the mysterious events in spiritual terms. Parishioners were instructed to remain vigilant and to pray for guidance, but the religious explanations offered little practical means of uncovering the truth. The intersection of superstition and faith created a lens through which community members tried to make sense of the horror. While some wondered if divine punishment or demonic influence was at play, others were left grappling with the incomprehensibility of human evil existing within familiar landscapes. Doctors and medically trained individuals were drawn into the unfolding mystery when signs of unexplained death emerged among travelers. Limited knowledge of decomposition, forensic science, and pathology hindered attempts at rational explanation. Reports of missing persons reached physicians in neighboring towns, who speculated on causes ranging from accidents to disease. When investigators examined the farm's livestock, the unusual growth and health of the pigs raised further questions. Some medical professionals considered the possibility of unnatural feeding or exposure to human remains, but without direct evidence, these observations remained speculative. Newspapers, too, played a role in shaping public perception. Local editors received letters describing strange noises, missing travelers, and unsettling behavior on the farm, but publishing such claims risked libel accusations in the absence of proof. Some articles framed the farm as a place of folklore and rumor, cautioning readers without definitively asserting criminal activity. The tension between sensational storytelling and journalistic prudence created an ambiguous narrative that fueled both curiosity and fear. Readers were left uncertain, oscillating between belief in the supernatural, suspicion of human malice, and resignation to mystery. Within families, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Children were warned to avoid contact with strangers and to treat the farm as a forbidden zone. Adults monitored each other, questioning the character of acquaintances who might venture near the property. Conversations became coded. Phrases about checking on the pigs or visiting the barn carried latent meanings understood only by those attuned to the growing fear. Trust, a cornerstone of rural life, was eroded, replaced by wariness and cautious observation. Social dynamics were further complicated by Carter's reputation. His outward appearance of normalcy, combined with acts of occasional generosity, maintained a veneer of respectability. Neighbors wrestled with cognitive dissonance. How could a man so familiar, seemingly upright, also be responsible for the disappearances? This psychological tension reinforced the power of rumor, as suspicion coexisted with admiration and gratitude, creating a paradox that delayed decisive action. Community meetings were called sporadically to discuss safety, but debate often devolved into accusations and defensiveness. Families demanded explanations, yet the mechanisms for investigation, rural constables, limited law enforcement, and informal oversight were ill-equipped to substantiate claims. The farm remained a locus of anxiety, its isolation both concealing the crimes and amplifying the dread that permeated neighboring settlements. In private, some individuals attempted direct investigation. Men patrolled the perimeter of the farm, occasionally observing the pigs and noting the odd arrangement of pens and hidden enclosures. Their findings were inconclusive. Carter's meticulousness obscured any clear evidence of wrongdoing. Psychological fear compounded these difficulties. The mere idea of discovering human remains or confronting Carter's methods deterred direct action. Community members rationalized avoidance, leaving the farm's secrets intact while acknowledging an underlying threat. Over time, these collective responses created a culture of subtle vigilance. People spoke cautiously, observed patterns quietly, and maintained a delicate balance between curiosity and fear. The story of the farm and the farmer's dark activities became embedded in local oral tradition, transmitted as cautionary tale and folklore. Newcomers were warned, travelers were instructed to circumvent the area, and the narrative of horror became inseparable from the geography itself. The combination of social, religious, medical, and journalistic responses highlights the interplay between human perception and limited knowledge in rural 19th century America. Carter's crimes, while extreme, exploited precisely the constraints and assumptions of his environment. Isolation, trust, and gaps in scientific understanding amplified the horror, allowing it to persist unnoticed until the subtle signs of abnormality could no longer be ignored. Ultimately, the reaction of the community illustrates how fear spreads in the absence of certainty and how social structures, cultural norms, and psychological mechanisms shape both awareness and inaction. The terror was not only in the acts themselves, but in the pervasive uncertainty, the whispered warnings, and the communal reckoning with the possibility of malevolence embedded within the everyday. The climax of Carter's grim saga unfolded on a night thick with fog, when the boundary between the ordinary and the grotesque blurred completely. A traveling merchant, unaware of the farm's sinister reputation, arrived under cover of darkness seeking lodging. His arrival was greeted with the customary warmth lights in the windows, the clatter of dishes, and the polite offer of a meal. The farm appeared ordinary, even inviting, masking the horror that lay beneath. As night deepened, the merchant was shown to a room above the barn, a space that seemed unremarkable except for the faint, lingering odor of damp earth. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the landscape and muffling distant sounds. Only the soft, irregular grunts of the pigs broke the quiet, a foreboding rhythm that seemed to echo the tension building within the house. Carter, fully aware of his visitor's unfamiliarity, began the final orchestration. The barn door was left slightly ajar, a faint trail of straw deliberately strewn to guide both the merchant and the pigs. Subtle cues, imperceptible to the untrained eye, directed the man toward the enclosure, where the culmination of Carter's long series of crimes awaited. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, an almost imperceptible aroma that would only later be understood for what it signified. The merchant, initially curious, followed the trail as if drawn by instinct. The fog obscured the familiar shapes of the barn, turning the ordinary architecture into a shifting, menacing landscape. Each step brought him closer to the central pen, where the pigs, larger and more agitated than any ordinary farm animals, waited. Their eyes glinted in the dim light, reflecting an unnatural intelligence that unnerved the observer. Carter remained in the shadows, silently guiding the unfolding events with deliberate calm. Suddenly, the merchant realized his peril. A wooden plank, part of the concealed mechanism Carter had installed, gave way under his weight, sending him plunging into a hidden pit. The fall was brief but disorienting, leaving him momentarily stunned. From below, the pungent smell of earth, straw, and something more sinister enveloped him. The pigs, sensing the intruder, responded with instinctive ferocity. Their grunts intensified, creating a symphony of menace that seemed to reverberate through the fog-laden night. Carter descended quietly, observing the scene with clinical detachment. He guided the merchant toward the pen, using a combination of subtle prods and strategic positioning. The pigs, already unnaturally conditioned, advanced as if anticipating the ritual, reinforcing the sense of inevitability that permeated the climax. The merchant, struggling against confusion and fear, became acutely aware of his isolation, the fog, and the mechanical ingenuity of his captor. Every element, sound, smell, texture was calibrated to maximize both control and terror. As the night progressed, Carter employed the full extent of his knowledge. He ensured that each movement, each reaction, and each outcome reinforced his ultimate design: to convert the merchant into sustenance for the pigs without leaving evidence. The barn became a stage for this macabre performance, its familiar walls transformed into instruments of horror. The pigs, conditioned over months of human feeding, moved with precision that defied natural expectation, their behavior amplifying the terror of the situation. Meanwhile, the surrounding fog seemed to participate in the climax, isolating the farm from prying eyes and muffling potential intervention. The night air carried a tension that was almost tangible, a combination of anticipation, dread, and the finality of impending fate. Carter's meticulous planning allowed him to control the narrative entirely. The farm itself, the animals, and even the weather conspired, intentionally or not, to facilitate the consummation of his design. The merchant's struggle, brief yet desperate, was the pinnacle of suspense. Every effort to escape was countered by the environment Carter had manipulated so carefully. The hidden trapdoors, the confined space of the pen, and the behavior of the pigs, all orchestrated with precision, ensured that the outcome was inevitable. The sense of impending doom was heightened by the silence surrounding the property, broken only by the guttural sounds of the pigs and the faint rustling of straw. Witnesses, though distant and unaware of the exact proceedings, later reported seeing flickers of movement in the fog, shadows that seemed unnatural in form and pace. The community's collective unease intensified that night, though no one could pinpoint the cause. Fear was now inseparable from the geography of the farm. The property itself became emblematic of a lurking, incomprehensible threat. By the early hours of morning, the climax reached its conclusion. The merchant, now beyond resistance, became part of the grotesque cycle Carter had perfected over years. The pigs, fed and sated, returned to their habitual routines, leaving behind only traces that would go unnoticed by casual observers. The fog lifted slightly, revealing an outwardly normal farm once more, masking the horrors that had unfolded within its perimeter. This night marked the apex of Carter's terror. It demonstrated not only his ingenuity and ruthlessness, but also the broader vulnerabilities of isolated communities. The mechanisms of fear, trust, and environmental control converged to allow unspeakable acts to occur in plain sight. Every element of the climax, from the fog and the architecture to the animals and human psychology, was manipulated with near-surgical precision. The broader community, still unaware of the full extent of the events, experienced a ripple effect. Stories of missing travelers intensified, children became more fearful, and adults whispered about strange noises and scents that had previously been dismissed. Carter's farm had become a locus of terror whose effects extended beyond its boundaries, embedding horror into the collective consciousness of the region. In essence, the climax was not merely a single event, but the culmination of a systematic, deeply calculated series of actions. It revealed the extent of Carter's intelligence, the vulnerability of human trust, and the terrifying intersection of environment, psychology, and biology. The night exemplified the methodical orchestration of horror, leaving an enduring mark on the landscape, the animals, and the memories of those living in its shadow. The narrative of Carter's ultimate night would be recounted in hushed tones for decades, a chilling lesson in the capacity for evil to operate unnoticed within familiar spaces. The interplay of fear, isolation, and cunning ensured that the climax of his crimes remained both hidden and profoundly impactful. A dark apex that defined the legend of the farm and solidified Carter's place in the annals of historical horror. In the years following Carter's final known crimes, the farm took on a spectral presence in the region, its history etched into local memory as a cautionary tale. The physical landscape remained largely unchanged. The barn stood weathered but intact, the pens were maintained, and the farmhouse appeared from the outside no different than any other rural dwelling. Yet for those who lived nearby, an invisible shadow lingered, a lingering unease that could not be rationalized. The site itself became synonymous with uncertainty, a space where the boundary between ordinary life and horror seemed permanently blurred. The community never fully reconciled with what had occurred. Some families relocated, unwilling to remain in proximity to a place that had witnessed unimaginable acts. Others stayed, perhaps out of necessity, but their daily lives were subtly altered. Children were taught from a young age to avoid the farm, to treat it as forbidden ground, and to view its history with reverent fear. Even generations later, parents would recount stories of the Carter farm, not as mere legend, but as a tangible, cautionary memory embedded in the environment. Historians and folklorists who later investigated the case were met with fragmented evidence. Letters, diaries, and sporadic newspaper clippings hinted at the macabre events, but verification was elusive. Oral tradition filled in the gaps, adding layers of interpretation that mixed fact with exaggeration, memory with myth. The narrative of Carter and his pigs became a cultural artifact, a lens through which subsequent generations examined morality, isolation, and human capacity for cruelty. Speculation persisted regarding the scale and continuity of Carter's crimes. Some theorists suggested that unrecorded victims might have vanished without notice, their fates forever entwined with the land. Others examined the biological implications, pondering how pigs could sustain themselves on such irregular diets and whether subtle changes in their behavior reflected exposure to human remains over time. The eerie precision of Carter's methods raised questions about intent, intelligence, and the ethical void that allowed these acts to go undetected. The psychological impact on the surrounding population endured. The farm acted as a locus of collective trauma, shaping social dynamics long after Carter's death or disappearance. Families reported persistent unease, nightmares, and irrational fears associated with the land. Behavioral patterns avoiding certain paths, hesitating at fences, monitoring strangers became ingrained, illustrating the subtle yet enduring imprint of horror on human cognition. Anthropologists and psychologists would later use cases like Carter's as examples of how fear and memory intertwine to influence community. Behavior and intergenerational storytelling debate continued over Carter's ultimate fate. Some argued he had died quietly, leaving the farm to revert to normalcy, while others speculated he may have continued his activities in secret or elsewhere, exploiting the lack of oversight in rural America. The ambiguity of his end contributed to the mythos surrounding the farm, leaving a residue of uncertainty that enhanced the region's folkloric identity. In a sense, the story never truly concluded. The absence of closure ensured the narrative remained active, a lingering question mark in the cultural consciousness. The ecological consequences were subtle yet profound. The pigs, conditioned to an unnatural diet, exhibited behaviors distinct from ordinary livestock. Farmers and animal observers noted unusual aggressiveness, heightened awareness, and social structures among the pigs that suggested long-term adaptation. These anomalies, while never fully explained, became part of the broader narrative of human interference, illustrating the interplay between human activity and animal behavior, and adding a layer of natural mystery to the already unsettling story. Culturally, the legend of the farm became embedded in literature, oral storytelling, and eventually in media representations of historical horror. Writers, filmmakers, and storytellers drew upon the events as emblematic of the hidden darkness that could exist within ordinary life. The story's combination of methodical cruelty, environmental manipulation, and community complicity resonated, reinforcing the perception that human evil could be both systematic and invisible, operating in plain sight. Scientific inquiry, though limited, offered cautious reflection. Early forensic investigators speculated on decomposition, odor detection, and biological waste cycles, attempting to understand how Carter had evaded detection for so long. Modern scholars have revisited these considerations, analyzing the ecological and physiological plausibility of long-term human feeding to livestock. While definitive conclusions remain elusive, the ongoing examination underscores a persistent human desire to rationalize, categorize, and learn from extreme behaviors, even when morality and instinct clash. Ultimately, The epilogue of Carter's farm is defined by ambiguity, reflection, and the enduring presence of the unknown. The land remains, witnesses of an invisible horror, its history accessible only through fragmentary records, oral tradition, and collective memory. Visitors who approach the site often report a subtle chill, a feeling that something unseen watches from the shadows. The echoes of Carter's actions persist, not only in the physical environment, but in the psychological landscape of those who know the story. The farm's legacy is thus twofold. It is both a historical case study and a moral parable. It illustrates the capacity for hidden cruelty within seemingly ordinary settings, while also emphasizing the mechanisms by which communities process, contain, and remember such acts. Reflection on the story encourages questions about human nature, societal responsibility, and the ways in which fear and mystery shape cultural consciousness. Even today, over a century later, the narrative remains unresolved in the minds of many. Whether Carter survived to continue his work elsewhere, whether his pigs exhibited lasting behavioral changes, or whether the land itself retains a psychological imprint of his deeds, remains unknown. The absence of concrete answers ensures that the tale continues to haunt, provoking contemplation, speculation, and a lingering unease that transcends time. In the end, Carter's farm is more than a location. It is a symbol of the hidden, the forbidden, and the morally ambiguous. It challenges observers to confront discomforting truths about human potential for secrecy, cruelty, and manipulation of both environment and society. Its story is preserved in memory, research, and legend, a dark history that invites reflection and leaves an indelible mark on the imagination.